Hey, this is Complexity Medicine. Welcome to Wanderings and Wonderings, Reveries, Remembrances, and Reflections in Health and Healing, an ongoing series of spontaneous and otherwise unplanned discussions about health, both in our lives and within the world at large. We hope to foster the telling of non-linear, context-rich, and passionate stories that capture a sense of relationship and connectivity to life. We hope you walk away with a head bursting with ideas, a heart overflowing, or at the very least, a beautiful sense of confusion. I am artist Andy McClure, and this is Dr. William Sutherland, your hosts.
All right. So welcome everybody to our Complexity Medicine Wanderings and Wonderings podcast. And I am here with my friend and colleague, Zak Stein. And so who is Zak? I just wanted to let everybody know, when I am in a dark place and muddled in my thinking, and I am in need of a brilliance and a light, then I like to call up Zak and enjoy the shine that comes off of him. And so, Zak, I'm happy to be here in all of your brilliances, not just academic. Brother, I'm glad that we found our way into this reunion. And I'm glad for the enjoyment of it all. We're putting a recording to this conversation with the idea of we're going to start somewhere, and we have no idea where this will go or where it will wrap. But first off, let me just express my gratitude that we can be here together in this way today now.
No, I'm happy to be here. And it's been a while since we spoke. And the prior times we spoke, I remember thinking that probably should have been recorded or something, because they were good conversations, and I think useful for people to listen in on probably. So very curious where we end up today.
You know, and just on that note, I felt the same thing, but I do love the tension of things that are ephemeral, you know, that we have these moments, they're felt, we come together, there is some kind of creative movement, a new and novel idea or perspective or position comes forth. It is healing and it is the medicine of the moment. And then it just moves off like the sound of a bell. You know, and we have, and then at other times I do love the idea. And the thing that I've enjoyed most about recording, believe it or not, is actually leaving something in posterity for my children, right? Because they're not interested in anything I have to say now. And maybe they never will be. But at some point, I really am grateful that they can see, you know, the people that their father got to talk with, the kind of conversations, the way that we make relationship, even more than we say. I love that we're role model. We're leaving a track and a record of a role model of ways that we can be in relation. And I actually kind of think that may be some of the root reasons that I'm even doing this thing called recording at all, are just laying down the tracks with the hope that somebody may feel, in a sense of the true sense of that word, of inspired, in spiritus, that sense of that comes in with that out breath, so that they can relax. That in breath, they can relax with that out breath, and feel something in that.
I love that reflection. I mean, as a musician, that was my experience. In fact, that so much of the best music that I ever played was never recorded, and intentionally so, which is to say, like, there's to recognize that it's ephemeral and to do it in nature or in a place where recording would be anathema, and where it is exactly an ephemeral gift, that it's precisely the beauty of it is that it happened for a moment and then it stopped, and that there is no record. So, and I think for some types of innovation, including innovation in conversation and theorizing and other things, it's like, it helps to actually not be creating artifacts, to be in a open freedom. But yeah, of course, we also want artifacts. And so that tension is actually a dynamic tension.
It is.
Yeah, like with thinking as well, like thinking and writing, and the making manifest is different from the kind of like bubbling, frothy edge of creation that's never kind of like lands. So that's very interesting.
And I mean, obviously we're coming into this conversation in the context of this moment, right? It's been a while since we spoke. We have the reunion. Our lives have gone on. We're coming back now to share in that intersection of, of the harvest of those things. And so I do love the ephemeral in that way, and the music and the jazz and the improvisation, the creativity that comes out of that, and whether it be just the art of conversation, because it's so fully born of a context. And of course, the tracks afterwards, the recorded one, have the tracks that point back to the context. For those that can read it, they can go and say, oh, what was happening in that moment, with them in those times in this discussion. But the thing I always remember too, and I love about the recording, is that even though this recording itself will sort of reify and freeze the ephemeral, it may be that just the juice or the live piece of flame that somebody else needs in their ephemeral moment when they hear it, a spark that brings them into their creative, rhythm and jam. And so, I can only hope that these types of things are gifts in that way, more than the abstractions that we may talk about, more than the theories we may articulate. I enjoy all those in that sense that part of me enjoys it. But I think the offering of this hopefully is more than that. I know it will.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's why I write books, because I had so many experiences with books of finding one which I'd never heard of, which no one had really ever heard of, which completely blew my mind, especially with the creation of synchronicities and other things that books can do. And so I wanted to have a book in the world that could be that kind of like the random chaotic cause, like the very strange, subtle, low level choice difference as a result of the book. And so those kinds of things are super interesting. In my sense is that the internet is kind of like a synchronicity machine, in part because of the algorithms are actually making things appear which look synchronistic, but are actually the result of surveillance, but also in part because of the sheer saturation of information and semiotic engagement, so that you're in a situation where a podcast like this or other things, it's very hard to know what the ramification of its existence will be, how long it will exist, how many people will listen to it. If it's here and it's still here 10 years from now, it could go viral 10 years from now for some reason we can't imagine. So yeah, there's a lot of complexity in what could be called like the transmedia hyper conversation, which is an atemporal conversation taking place across all of these different dimensions of the transmedia digital thing. And so yeah, each little recording is like a very, very complex system. It's an entry into that system, and it's an information system. Yep, that's the hyper conversation. That's why it's fun to do podcasts, and that's what makes conversation in the 21st century different from conversations in prior times, because it was basically all ephemeral, unless you wrote it down. And then, so there's a major difference in that kind of compounding cultural memory of all of these conversations.
Just as you're saying that, there's a couple of, I love that notion that up until very recently, was it Gutenberg? Is that the printing press? Was that the
yeah.
And before that, we had scribes transcribing a book or a few, right. The Bible plus whatever, a few other, things that were church approved. But I love that idea that for all of the vast majority of the generations that we've been human and conversations that we've had in whatever form, and of course, the majority of that being storytelling, right. The story of the day, the catching of the day, the stories of the day being imbricated and woven into the mythologies that were the holding of those days. I love that notion that they are ephemerally, in some sense lost to the winds. And that's, again, the idea of being lost in the winds is also, there's also the notion of return, on the winds of a return of a certain kind of spirit. I want to go back to the ancestor bit, but I want to go to that sort of, what was the word that you used? Hyper.
I used, it was a hyper conversation in a transmedia digital landscape.
Lovely. I like there in itself is a metaphor of a new metaphoring, right, of new languaging. And so I think the one thing I come to think about right away is with COVID, for example, this point was made that human beings are not good with exponential growth, right? This idea that we don't really, we're linear beings and we're not good with exponentiality. And, the classic, if you had a bacteria multiplying in a test tube once every minute over a 24-hour period, what is it, at 59, at 57 minutes, it's 1/3 full.
Right.
And at 1 minute before an hour, it's overflowing, right? But you've got the vast majority of the day where you don't even necessarily see this growth, this exponentiality. And I think too, when you talked about, just the nature that we put this type of thing out into, the interweb, the sphere of all of this, and, is it going to be lost, lost within the noise? Will it find its signal? And will it find its virality? But the nonlinearity of all of that, again, is very hard for us as human beings, I think, to comprehend. Like, we see the product of it, but how that happens, and I think that so many people, again, I think that the mistake is to try to make that happen, right? Maybe there is a recipe to how to make something, go viral or to become an influencer or whatever that is. But as we're doing this, that's not my interest at all. I just love the notion that we simply can put it out there and then see, like good bait, what will bite, and really then enjoy the fishing of it. Where does it travel? And like a good fishing tail or a whale tail, where does it take off of? And where does that go? And how does it come around? And does it break, or does it get knotted? Or do we see this get pulled up, or maybe not in our lifetime? I don't know. All of that's just on one level fascinating. And on the other level, I think about the non-ephemeral of the ancient, and I'm reminded of the cave paintings, like in Lascaux, like these ancient places. Where are these places of petriform? Were these tracks that have literally been enduring over tens of thousands of years still grab our attention, and still hold this mystery in their utter simplicity of place and time?
Totally. Yeah. And it's interesting to think about the history of human conversation and communication, and thinking about language use and what have we used language for? Like, why language in the society? What's the purpose? And you're saying, for storytelling, and storytelling specifically in a way that creates identity. So it's like and community and a whole bunch of other things. So there's a way in which the conversations are ephemeral, but they become encoded in the people, in the identities, in the rituals and habits. And so you get this like down propagation from the imaginal and semantic into the embodied and social. And so that's worth noting. And then, so we mostly use language to coordinate our actions together, to understand one another, to create identity. We use it sometimes to talk about things in the world, like objective states of affairs. And then you could argue that over time, language use has evolved drastically. And some of the language use that dominates our culture is actually not fit to serve the dominant use language has had, which has been identity creation. So the question of the degree to which, for example, scientific, descriptive, materialist languages and the language where the point of using the language and playing the language game, if you will, is to say something true about causal events in the world. The degree to which that kind of language is appropriate for the things that ancients used to do when they coordinated their understanding around myth and where we are and who I am and what the moral structure of things is, right? So it's about as language evolved, you get these differentiating language games. It's basically mostly Jürgen Habermas, and you get that differentiation. And so some of what we're seeing is both the codification of conversation through digital capture and archive, but also the hegemony of certain forms of dominant language use practice over others. And so we have a paucity of language of self-understanding and a paucity of language of strong evaluation. and the internal imagery and the cultural mythos and ethos, which requires a tremendous amount of language practice and family and community, like hours and hours and hours spent talking about the meaning of our lives and what our community is and how it fits into the universe. Like, this is what we used to do. Now we get a whole bunch of disassociated headlines from scientists and academics telling us confusing things about the nature of the world and about what the human is. And a lot of our time is spent arguing and debating about what the state of affairs actually is in the world, like scientific disputes, and which are important. But I'm saying distracting and actually trick us into thinking that language is useful for something that it's only partly useful for, So that's kind of where I went with that, in part as an educator, thinking about what's the difference now in these dynamics of intergenerational transmission, and what are the languages we are using and kind of passing on. And this hyper conversation in the transmedia context, like, that's a very novel environment to be socialized into as a young person. And the forms of language and how you understand imagery in these things, it's unprecedented. Unprecedented is like a weird word to use these days because everything basically is unprecedented, but there is something very novel, anthropologically novel, like much more different than. So it's a deep change in the conditions of socialization, and
disconcerting too. It's a disconcerting change, really.
Certainly, I think so. I mean, people try to pull the punch and say, like, "Oh, there are good things too about it," and there are. But at the same time, if you know about the way the brain works, and you know about human health and especially psychological health, then it becomes clear that many of these things are demonstrably unhealthy in the way that, for example, smoking is demonstrably unhealthy. Like, that it's not about like a values preference. It's about this is brain damage is being inflicted upon children. Like, I think it's that. And I think we'll come to understand that. But it'll take some time. And it'll be like we were with smoking, where we'll be like, whoa, we had doctors and stuff promoting smoking, and we're suppressing the evidence.
Smoking in their office.
Right, exactly. And we're suppressing the evidence. And I think sometime from now, this is following with like Tristan Harris's work, the Center for Humane Technology, and that movie, The Social Dilemma, which has been quite popular. Sometime from now, we'll realize what has happened, and then there'll be big warning stickers and a whole bunch of stuff will be dialed back and begin to protect the minds and brains of young people again from predation by technology companies, basically, and advertising companies.
I'm going to just go back to that. I searched for that word disconcerting. I'm like, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Because it's going to come up. And so when I think about it etymologically, right, being out of concert, concert, right? Concert. That somehow before, and again, I got goosebumps when you said that, like about language. Yes, it is ephemeral, but yet you see it find its form and density and mass in the ritual, in the traditions, in the shared, it's held at the level of the culture, right? The whole, that these stories, dreams, visions, moments of days, all being woven in. And I've never, despite having spent so much time with traditional Indigenous people and having had the blessing of being part of these, ceremonial and ritualistic expressions and sharings, I never once looked and said, oh, this is language manifest, in that beautiful, deep way. And I don't know if I'm going to tell you, since you said that, I'm going to see that I'm going to actually now see that this is a story. When I see that lodge or this movement or this dance or this song, that it is actually the holding in an expression of the story that now may be wordless, but was once formed by those words. It also, what you said there made me think about, just where language is going. The Bushmen, my good friend and mentors, they're a lovely couple, the Keeneys, Brad and Hillary Keeney. Brad he spent a lot of time, decades living with the Bushmen. And, as he related to me once, he asked the Bushmen, what is your sort of essentially, what is the use you have? What's your use for language? They said, well, we actually have two uses for language. One is to knock people down a block, to knock them down a step or two when they're starting to get a little bit, big in the head. Like, good hunter comes back with lots of meat, starting to feel pretty good about himself. They had a tradition called insulting the meat, and it was just ruthless teasing to bring everybody back down, to village size. Their head didn't fit in the village. You're going to bring it back, and so they would insult the meat. And so that was one use. That was a use for language, and the other use for language was telling jokes. Was for humorous moments.
Which is a similar social mechanism, right?
You're right. With that sort of that right hemispheric collapsing of levels, right? We're going to collapse your ego, but the humor always, of course, is a collapsing of two levels, and it lets you open. Maybe a third use. Well, it wasn't even then, because most of their songs they were chants, they weren't worded. And they said anything outside of those two domains, now you're in the trickster's territory. So if you want to play with the trickster, play with language. But otherwise, if you want to stay away from that trickstery, the trickster isn't the devil. The trickster is always indigenous.
Because you're making incantations, or you're doing other things with language. And that's super fascinating. And that's reflected in linguistic anthropology, which is kind of where I'm pulling from. And it's important to get that, like, those two uses they identified are uses that have to do with social cohesion and the organization of social hierarchy and self-understanding with regards to community and world. And so that is, again, reflected in the kind of research, if you will, that, the primary use of language is actually that. And that the use of language where you break apart a specialized discourse that is primarily concerned with saying things about causality and what's true and what's not, is a later emergence. And so propositionally differentiated speech, sometimes called different from an utterance of an animal. And the question of what distinguishes the human from the very advanced primates usually ends up hinging around this issue. It's not about communication, because all the animals communicate, really. And it's not even about complex communication or even abstraction from concrete reality in terms of mental images, because clearly animals do this. But there's obviously something that human does different, right? Yeah. So what is that? And it ends up being that little moment around the proposition of differentiated speech, but specifically, and this is Mike Tomasello's point, who was at the Max Planck Institute, specifically the situation of joint attentional awareness, which is you and I sharing this thing as a referent and using basically a kind of propositional differentiated speech about it. And so there's a inescapably rooted intersubjectivity or culture. And his point was, Tomasello's, intergenerational transmission, teaching and learning. These are actually the things that separate us from the animals. A specific kind of joint attention where the elder uses language to basically pass along the dimensions of the culture that need to be passed along. And that's what allows us to ratchet up into increasingly complex forms of culture and language use, is this ability to pass on intergenerationally innovation and retain tradition. And so you don't find that in animals. You do find occasionally things like common techniques being used in an area, but you don't get the ratcheting effect of cultural evolution based upon this cumulative process of intergenerational transmission mediated by the joint attentional situation with propositionally differentiated speech. So that's it's a complex way to say something simple, which is that language was primarily emerged evolutionarily, if you will, to help us orient together about the world.
Let me jump in there too, because I'm as you're talking, I'm literally getting goosebumps in these ideas, and I as I will often do. I love my time with the Bushman people of Namibia, and I do like referencing, because as I do, and many of other people that I know that have spent considerable time living with them, there is, they are the descendants of the world's oldest people, as we know from mitochondrial DNA, speech and phoneme analysis, complexity of music and musicology. I mean, tool use. There's all of these things that just point to this, very primordial and ancient culture that we've ultimately all descended from. ourselves. I mean, we have, if we're here in the world, we have successful hunter-gatherers to thank for this. But what a couple of the traditions I loved with this, every day, imagine this when you're with, again, there's that Dunbar number of community that the traditional, and again, of course, modernity has ravaged the Bushman culture, just like all of the cultures, traditional indigenous cultures of the world. But I got to be with some old men and women that, had lived at the tail end of this nomadic, essentially adapted Stone Age world of living. And one of the great things they would do, so they go out in their day, whether it be the men would be tracking and hunting, the women would be gathering, but they would all be going out, and they had this original literacy. It wasn't the literacy of letters and words, but it was a literacy of the tracks of the land. So when they would go out, and not just, they would obviously have the technical skill of reading tracks, but they had the embodied, the ability to align themselves embodily with the animal and become it, as it was moving. And so they would literally read themselves within the landscape, right? So there was a story there, and there was their story unfolding of following and reading the story that was unfolding in front of them. And they would come and say, and it was always shared because they had, there was a saying in tracking: if you track alone, you're always right in your interpretation. but when you have three or four, right, you have to actually find.
It's a great saying.
Yeah,
you track alone, you're always right.
You're always right. Yeah, and a poor hunter as a result. And so they would find these stories, and same for the women. And at the end of the day, they'd come home, and of course, different groups were on different vectors and tracks of the land, so they all held a part of the story of the day. The other groups held another part. And when they came together, they recognized that they could then put the intersections together like puzzle pieces. So by the campfire, my friend John Young spent a number of years living, again, with some Bushman groups in Botswana. And they would have this whole tradition of the story of the day. And around the fire, they would literally, and again, in very performative, embodied, very much body humor ways, would tell their story. Now, there's a couple of phenomena. Often people would all talk at once. They had literally had the cognitive wiring that 4 or 5 people could be talking and telling the story. Everybody could be talking back and replying, and they were literally hearing and listening in their entirety all together. And any of us that have seen this, it's mind-blowing. We're just like, how can this happen? It's chaos. It looks like a cacophony, but that's there. And then there was this other great thing. So they would tell a story, and then they would receive it. There was the idea that you would receive their story. Then everybody else would start telling the story that was just told as though they were that person. And they would try to tell it better, like they would literally do the things and then it became this, and the story would travel as they would all tell it. And they would try to out-tell each other of the original story. And by the time it came around, it was an even more embellished further, a fuller caricature of the original, and everybody's laughing and moving, and so that's the story world. And then there was this whole other world, like the dance. After that, very often they would go to the dance, and this healing dance is literally the world's oldest healing expression, greater than 50,000 years if you look at the rock art. This transmutations and transformations of form and being, these metamesis and metamorphosis of literally of ontology. They would become these two creations. One was called the first, what was the ever-changing, ever-morphing, and then second, which is our world, where out of all the possible change, this thing called not change shows up, but they're still there and they're juxtaposed, and you can enter in between these two worlds. And so then they would have this other transmission, like you're talking about transmissions, right? So there was the transmission in word, through the day, from very pragmatic to enjoyment to cultural myth and ritual and sharing. And then there was this other kinesthetic transmission of rhythm, dance, spirited touch, vision, and there was no words. As a matter of fact, you would get to such an ecstatic state that language would literally leave you. You would open your mouth and I would come like, something like no language. It just wasn't there anymore. Right. And these two transmissions were like these two closely living things. This was a weekly. This was a daily and weekly occurrence.
Right. That's so fascinating. I mean, so much to say, because it's like, you probably know Ian McGilchrist's work, right? The Master and His Emissary.
Love it. And I'm literally rereading. I read the book, and now I'm going through the audio book as we speak. And if the gods so deem it, I'd like to have him on this talk, one of these talks too.
Yeah, because in that book, there's this, and he's mentioned it in passing, but it's very fascinating. It's basically archaeological evidence suggesting that the human vocal cords were fully developed before the frontal lobes were developed. And so the idea was that, like, oh, the vocal cords kind of followed the development of language. And the reason we have such complex vocal cords is because the brain kind of demanded it, because it needed to make such a wide variety of, phonemes, basically, the verbal products. And our vocal cords can, of course, imitate almost any animal, right? And they can do all those crazy impressions that, like, the comics do. Like, they're incredibly versatile vocal cords. And the idea was that was because of language. This archaeology basically shows this is not the case. The cranium wasn't developed enough in these skulls, but the space where the vocal cord would be in the throat, was. And so McGilchrist says the conclusion to reach here is that before we were speaking and propositionally differentiated, telling the story about what the tiger did, language users, we were singers, basically, that the upright walking humanoid-like creatures who roamed the kind of Eden-like woods before propositionally differentiated speak came together and organized through song. They were a species that could imitate any other animal and who would transmit and communicate and live with one another, mediated through the ability to do very complex things that would occur to us to sound like singing, harmonizing rhythms, other things of that nature. And then from the intersubjectivity and community and space between us created by the song, was slowly refined out these other practices that use those vocal cords, which were the practices we know as like language and propositional differentiated speech. So in that Bushman two-part structure, you can see that there's the non-linguistic but deeply community-building song practice, dance practice, which allows for a pre-verbal, if you will, deep coding of togetherness and community and other things. And then there's also the place where they actually use language to say, here's what happened, here's what happens here, and actually learn from one another about abstract state of affairs that happened hours ago. So that's just remarkable to see those kind of like deeply primordial uses of language actually.
And synergistically present.
And also differentiated. Like, so they're like related to one another in this rhythm of community practice. And it would be very difficult to say which one is more important for the health and sustainability and like continuance of the group, and so that's very interesting. And of course, the image of the early humanoids as these like incredibly beautiful singing creatures is a remarkable image that McGilchrist paints. And I can't speak to the archaeology specifically. I'm not an archaeologist, but McGilchrist seems to support that as a very intriguing hypothesis. For him, of course, it shows which of the hemispheres is actually dominant. Right, and it's not the one that uses language.
And again, it's not the one that uses the words.
Right, exactly.
The language is there. The language is used there, but the semantic is.
And that there's such rich content in human vocalization, even without semantic content.
I mentioned the Keeneys and their thesis, having worked intimately with so many Indigenous elders in this deep sharing way. When there's all this confusion, this word shaman gets batted around in all of these so many different in this modern, it's become it's one of those words that have been killed as a result of it. And sadly, but Hillary and Brad have done some lovely work to sort of reclaim the essence and root. I'll send you a paper that they wrote that it's just actually a brilliant paper on this sort of notion of how we can look at this sort of shamanistic age of our, both in our being coming through time and how that expresses, and perhaps maybe in some ways why it's even needed more than ever as we enter into these hyper real times of almost of a different kind of interconnection. But his definition was this: a shaman. It wasn't any of these other things that you think. It was always very simple. It goes to exactly what he said. It essentially boiled down to this: no song, no shaman. And shamans in Hillary and Brad's perspective were those that were song catchers. And again, it wasn't that like song makers. It was the through you, not of you song, right? It was the song where, the numinous world of the seen and unseen sings you, right? And of course, what are we in that we're in now? Heated emotion, joy, ecstasy. That this is there. You have no other choice but to express it. Like it has to come forward, right? And that is its corrective thing. I remember with Brad's ethnography, he did this great series through an organization called Ringing Rocks of first-person accounts of these different healing traditions around the world. And he did 2 wonderful books of the Kalahari Bushmen. And there was one story, and I'm not sure if it was in there or in other books that he wrote around them, but there was a story about an old Bushman after the dance. And he says, after the dance, he goes, I just love everybody and everything. He goes, I have so much love after the dance. I even love the man who stole my wife. And so I just love that because you talked about the reorienting aspect of these communications.
Right.
The other one that on that notion of this catching your story each day, John, my friend John Young asked this old Bushman elder and healer, Hanama, he said, how many throughout your life, how many close friends that you could be deeply intimate and share with have you had throughout your life? Like, how often would you be able to have this? He said, it changes. I've moved some for community to community and times are tough. And he says, but there's always, I don't know, I've always had 3, 5, 10 people, that I could, always just talk to. And John was like, well, how often would that happen in your lifetime? Oh, every day. Versus like we go off to college, we have one experience with one person and we remember it as the most intimate and meaningful conversation that opened in this moment of magical synchronicity. And then we go on for the rest of our life holding that was the only reference point that we'll ever have of this kind of intimacy and connection. And the Bushmen are saying, well, actually, this is daily life. Like, how could you not have this? Like, that's got to be hell.
Right. Totally. It is. It is. Right.
It is.
And so there's so much. And so it's so rich to kind of do that juxtaposition, and especially like with a word like shaman, that there's a legitimate thing here that's deep from the anciency. And then there's this strange repurposing and repackaging of the notion. And I like that idea. No song, no shaman. I think this is correct. And there's the notion, I think Alexander Bard used it most fruitfully, the notion of the shamanoid personality type. That
I've never heard that.
Yeah, that there's basically that not everyone in the group was a shaman, that there were usually particular people who usually probably against their will, because there wasn't enough, not like you were in a competition to be the shaman. It's like if someone stands out as a particular type of person. And specifically the type of person who can go from your tribe maybe and can encounter a shaman from another tribe and not kill him. And that the shamanoid type is a small percentage of people who are basically like genetically predisposed to be 1 foot in the community, 1 foot out, 1 foot in the world, 1 foot in the underworld, and 1 foot in language, 1 foot in this other thing, which is not language, which would allow you to communicate with someone from another tribe. In a much different way. And his hypothesis is that like that continued, that there in our culture, there is still a subclass of people who are best characterized as shamanoid types. and they gravitate to certain fields like the arts and psychology and probably medicine and other places where there is the ability to bridge the underworld and the living world, or to, heal splits or to subject oneself to dismemberment, which is what a shaman usually subjects, some type of radical physical scarring or dismemberment or illness. So there's something about that which is interesting. It just came up when you mentioned shaman, that there's the reason we're thinking about this now is because I think we're desperate for the emergence in our culture of that kind of wisdom figure.
Well, let's take that moment to swing back to Dr. McGilchrist's work and thesis, because I just think, I don't know about you, but I'm finding that piece of work is just showing up everywhere foundationally in anything I start to talk about, because
this is one of the
which makes sense, because we're always carrying it with us,
exactly, that's
with each other, like, you know,
right. That's why it's an amazing book. Yeah,
it's an incredible, and the thesis of the social implication, right, of how I love the notion of it. He also said that they're two very discrete and worlds that can never touch, but when you think of them as binocular, like
right.
that you have a binocular vision with them, that
right.
then they work. And you know, and so one of the things is, of course, we're out of balance. We're into this left hemispheric gravity, you know, that is creating this disruption of cutting and rectilinearity and a loss of a sense of those interconnections and the lifelessness and the inanimate and the material and these things. And of course, people can go and look in. There's lots of on the internet of theses of his thesis, but you know, this idea of this what was the phrasing again? The
shamanoid.
The shamanoid. Thank you. Yeah. So the notion of this shamanoid character, like, so one of the things I think with the question that McGilchrist's work brings up is, how do we shift back to the right alchemy of right and left, such that we have such that we have a possibility of not going extinct in the linear trajectory we're on. Like, how does this fold back into life again?
Yeah.
And this idea of the shamanoid character, like this is not just a person in the world, but this is hitting to this idea of this balance, right? That like how you can be in this world and you can be in this world and you can be in the colosseum, the bridge between these worlds, and you can bridge those worlds with others that have these things called minds and brains, and they're not necessarily synonymous, as McGilchrist is good to pull out.
I think that's a great way to actually understand what the shamanoid type is pointing to. It's pointing to you could call it the non-domesticated Western brain, which is the brain that hasn't developed the overdominance of the left hemisphere for whatever reason. Like, for example, I'm learning disabled. So that's one of the reasons that I don't think I ever adopted the left, even though I'm super smart, quote unquote. Like, I was a musician first and actually reluctantly got into having to use language because I'm dyslexic. And I know that I communicate more with the tonality and tenor pacing of my voice than I do with the semantic content of it. That's very much a part of my awareness. So, but the point is, the shamanoid would have either a right hand dominance, which has its own problems, or would have that balancing. And the description of people drawn into psychotherapy and drawn into the arts, and these are those types who would have a more balanced brain, or a brain that has a right hand, which has again its own issues, and so depression and other stuff. So that's fascinating. And so this notion of the kind of neurodiversity becomes a survival one. Like, to the degree that we are homogenizing the nervous systems of young people, we are actually endangering the future of the species by monocropping and eliminating the shamanoid as an emergent possibility, which is what
So the diversity of that kind of presentation, that kind of person in the world, is that it's a needed diversity. If we bottleneck them out, it's at our own
it's actually not a bug, it's a feature, if you will. And so, like, that's how I came to see my dyslexia. Like, you're told, dyslexia is a disability. It is the result of an atypical equals bad, different nervous system. And it's like something that's broken, which if we could fix it, and I had people talking to me about this when I was at Harvard in the mind-brain education program, we could genetically know if someone's going to be dyslexic or not, and then basically preemptively stop the brain damage development through interventions in very early childhood. And I was like, Jesus, that's a terrible idea. But it's based on a misunderstanding of what dyslexia is. Like, in pictographic cultures, you don't have nearly the dyslexia. You have very, very, very much lower levels of dyslexia in pictographic cultures. And this is a very important point, in non-literate cultures, which is to say cultures where there is no reading, you have zero dyslexia. So dyslexia is very precisely the interface of
It's a disease of context.
It's a disease of context. It's very precisely the fit between the nervous system and the demands of this language system, specifically the grapheme-phoneme relationship. And so that, when I started to realize, I was like, oh man, my dyslexia is actually a feature, not a bug. You could see how, for example, the fact that my peripheral vision is actually better than my foveal vision. Like that is technically a deficit. Technically, because in our context, you're supposed to have foveal vision.
Well, in a left hemispheric way, but in a right hemispheric, this wide, diffuse vision that takes in the broad and movement, right? It takes in the non-specific movement, faint color.
Exactly. And you could see how that would be selected for genetically, and that you wouldn't want to reduce that. And that would also have kind of upward propagations through the nervous system to other cognitive traits. And so, the whole medicalization of academic underperformance is a move to homogenize nervous systems through biological intervention. When in fact, we're looking at a situation where the culture surrounding the child of the school, and sometimes even the materials themselves, are the actual issue, but they seem less immovable and tinkerable with than the nervous system of the kid. So we're misunderstanding how the situation works. We actually need to, and this is classic, we've been saying this for years, right? Like allow the uniqueness of the child's nervous system to be supported and not shave away the unique pieces so that it can fit in some in some specified aspect of this bureaucratic education system. And I think we may be able to begin to do that now because of the nature of what we were talking about. The hyper conversation, transmedia world allows for a kind of radical customization, but of course there's dangers too.
I think its own absurdity might be its savior, right? The absurdity is that we have information ad absurdum. Like we have so much fact in the world now. I think before we started to hit record, you said, oh yeah, this behind me is my extended brain. The books I've read, like I know where they are, I can reference. Of course, we are so many magnitudes beyond even the greatest libraries of the world in what is in there, right? And so
growing daily,
right? So the notion of a fact-based education is becoming of a knowledge base is ridiculous, which then throws us back to this possibility of inquiry-based, the idea of the formulation and holding of non-trivial questions that birth preferably more non-trivial questions, and at the very least non-trivial answers en masse over and over in their forms. And then the unique individual gets to chart their unique path through the unique series of questions that allows them to eventually see themselves anew, and so maybe, the absurdity of facts and knowledge in this world will open up to a meta possibility that actually what we only have left is good questioning, and maybe then we find the tailoring to these different learning styles and positions, and not trying to cookie cut people into molds.
Right, totally. And the novelty of our situation too is something I write about in my second book, Education in a Time Between Worlds, where I talk about this insight Margaret Mead had into these different kinds of cultures, where there's a culture where you grow up and you will do what your parents did, and they did what their parents did, and they did what their parents' parents did. And just the culture is basically there. And in those cultures, then it's completely non-problematic, basically, for the elders to pass along knowledge to the children, almost without question. Then you get cultures where the life you're going to live is somewhat similar to your parents' life, but it's going to be different as well, but not so different that your parents don't really have a sense of what the world will be like for you. They can understand and predict to some extent what the world will be like. And then again, there you still have a lesser, it's still not a problematic process of intergenerational transmission. When you get to the ones, and this is what Margaret Mead said we were stepping into, culture where the life that your children will live, you don't actually understand. That the elders are no longer in a position to be able to dictate to the children what the most important questions are that they should be asking, and what the skills are they should have to equip themselves to go out into the future. And there's a problem when that has happened in a culture, and the culture has not recognized that this happened. And then you begin to have miseducation instead of the culture realizing it's happening and then doing what Dewey and others and progressive educators have been saying for a long time, kind of flip the script and ask the kids what they think is important. Because they're actually able to imagine a future you can't imagine. And it's not, that doesn't mean the elders then don't have a role at all. Exactly the opposite. As soon as the kid has identified their unique question, unique vocation, which may not be something you really can quite understand the value of, but they have articulated well, then all of your resources as an elder are at your disposal to help the child to learn. But you don't know what they need to be. And to the extent you do, then you seek to design them when you should be raising them. And that's different metaphor.
And I think there's a skill in there too around question. Like I agree, like it's not for us to come and say, this is your question. Like you said, it would be for the child to say, I have this question. I think where our role, as I see it going forward now, as I look at the landscape, we're the same age. It's funny, right? Like somehow we're getting old here, Zach. We're all like,
you're older than me, but we don't have to get into that.
Yeah, okay, I'm older than I definitely. Yeah, I'm like, what the heck? I'm sporting a Mike Pence white hair here. Like, what's going on? I don't know how that happened. But the idea of then say like not the question, but how do you question questions? How do you create the question you're looking to create? Like the sort of virtuous doubles of that form, all of a sudden to me seems the holding, right? We're old, as we get older, the patience to hold a question.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And the tension of that holding.
Exactly. That's the obligation of the elders, not to tell the kid what to think, but it's to create the educational context and the safety and the scaffolding so that the real uniqueness and purpose of the child can emerge. And so it's not the kid gets to do whatever he wants, because that's damaging in a different way. Yeah. You're there, you are older and more powerful. Like there's a strong asymmetry.
You can set a necessary boundings and boundaries as are required.
Yeah. And so we're kind of circling back to Thomas Ellis, that the time it takes for the human to reach maturity is ridiculously long in the animal kingdom. Yeah. Like it's just unheard of. And so there must be something about intergenerational transmission, and specifically like the intimate reality of it. Me and you, and you're older and asymmetrically more knowledgeable and more powerful and stronger. And I depend on you, me and you, but you're that, and I'm me, and this world out here. Yeah. And that situation, and leaning into that as the basic structure that needs attention and care for civilization to survive. That's like the core of my educational philosophy. That if you think about schools and you think about like that, that's secondary to this primary thing. And this thing isn't even the family. It's not the family. It's a space of potential mutual understanding.
It's a positioning. It's a relation. It's a relational positioning. It's not bricks and mortar. It's not a curriculum. Right. It's not a how-to. It's a relational positioning. It's an asymmetrical relational positioning.
It's asymmetrical.
It's not power over, but it's asymmetrical.
And it's also like a natural process, which
that asymmetry completes a whole.
Yeah, completes a whole. Yeah,
it's a natural process.
So that's where one of the like acupuncture points is in this whole meta crisis, is that it's at the point of intergenerational transmission and protecting it the way one protects like a forest or something. It's like you can't make the forest grow. You can't make the forest grow, but you can protect the forest. And so similarly with intergenerational transmission, you can't make moms love children, and you can't make teachers create, environments like that where respect and authority and the things you need for teaching to take place are there. But you can protect those environments for it to naturally emerge as what it is.
So that's the key point here, right? The fostering,
right,
and the creating and the fostering of protecting the environment. I mean, the notion of intergenerational transmission itself is almost is like an endangered species. Like This idea, like this is really like, we talk about all these existential threats, but this kind of like, and we've always talked about generational
gap. But
gaps.
we started talking about generational gap. This was Margaret Mead's point.
Well, it's true. That's exactly, yeah.
Yeah, she was like, we're in a new time, man. This generation gap thing, you guys better pay attention to this.
But a generational severing, that is it's like severing limbs. Like, this is not good for a body.
No, now you're seeing it. That's actually, it's one of those things you can't almost detect, and it became normalized, especially with the predation on adolescent youth by advertising culture and other things. There became an acceptance that we were going to make the world as different as possible for the youth than it was from the parents. And like, that's innovation, that's advancement. And I'm not denying that there aren't things that are changing that are for the better, but there's been an acceleration of technological change at the base structure, which is repositioning generations farther and farther apart in their understanding of the world. And so the generation gap grows, and then you can have what I've called a catastrophic bifurcation of intergenerational transmission, which is what you're saying. There's a severing. And then you're in a position of what would be better thought of now as intergenerational warfare, because you still have to live with the boomers. Yeah. But now there's going to be a situation of complete disrespect and almost entirely strategic relationship to them, which is what happens in a bad family system. Of course,
strategic is the race. People, we may not recognize you use the word strategic. When I hear that, that's the race. That is the race to the bottom.
Now it's that
is not an elevated, relation of interdigitation and the respect of that connection. Yeah.
And so you're in a zero-sum game where the generations are now pitted against one another. And like, look at the student loan debt crisis. Yeah. And there's a few other things where you're like, how could you do that to your kids, man? And it's not my kids. Like, but it is.
It's their generation.
This is what I'm saying. So it's like that notion that we can entirely prey on a generation who is actually weaker than us, physically stupider than us, like, because that's the asymmetry. An inevitable, unavoidable asymmetry is built into that relationship, which means that we're in a position where there's a weaker party who is more vulnerable, but we live in a society where the weaker party who is more vulnerable is exactly the one who's preyed upon. Yeah. So kids are precisely in that position of being most vulnerable in a social system that is
predatory.
It's predatory, precisely. So so there's that's growing, and there's an awareness that's growing among the youth, I believe, which is to say, they know that they're getting the short end of the stick,
which is the starting to the smoldering embers of rebellion, right? And not the classic youth rebellion of like, whoa, dude, I'm long haired, like true rebellion, like violence,
like Al Qaeda is a rebellion. Of disaffected.
There's the lead, right? There's the lead in the world. We're already seeing the actual manifestation of that disenfranchising, right? And it happens. And it's easy to say other it because it's another religion, it's another culture, nothing to do with here. And yet you just have to look at any of the marginalized. Well, it's going to happen in the marginalized youth first, and then quickly the non-marginalized who have also been marginalized. It's just. They don't have the benefit of the double marginalization to easily see it, or they have the creature comforts to ignore it. But that rebellion possibility is there en masse, right?
Exactly. And then you see, of course, the elders know that. So then they begin to act strategically. So then you get the generational war. And it's actually a deep archetype. What is
the archetype? Is that like the Pinocchio and his father type of archetype?
That's a manifestation. James Hillman writes on it as the synex and the puer. And so the synex being the positive side of the synex is the wise old man, right? And then the puer means eternal youth. So the kind of hero, as it were. And then you have, the constellating around the god like Saturn, who would be your classic synex character. So there's a dark side of the synex, locks in order and overemphasizes structure and number and legacy and all those things. And then you
get like the Achilles character and his pride, the prideful Achilles.
The classic puers like Icarus or Achilles. And so that's like this deep tension within all of us between structure and chaos and between kind of a commitment to the past and kind of innovation in the future. And also those parts of us that are set in stone and lazy and difficult to change. And those parts of us that are constantly changing and bubbling up and moving around a lot. And so, yeah, there's a way in which what's interesting is that the negative synex fights the negative puer in an endless battle of intergenerational warfare. But the wise old man can sit with the youth on his knee. Like, this is one of the images in the alchemical tradition that they use to kind of like round that circle. They basically like say, oh no, the full image is not synex versus puer. It's synex and puer.
And it's an imbrication. It's a nisting.
Right.
It's no longer a plus minus negation, but it becomes an imbricated nisting as it properly should be. It becomes cybernetic. It becomes circular. It becomes eternal, perennial, rather than this Hegelian smash up.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That there's like different representations of it, like the son eats the king eats his son, or like that the king and his son are reunited. And so there's that sense of like the deeper pattern that plays out. That's why it's so volatile and you can feel it. That's why both parties are now aware that we're almost at a point of intergenerational warfare. So again, we're back to some kind of conservationist kind of project, which is about finding places where you can dial down the informational warfare and step back from the kind of weaponization of language and step into
storytelling, capturing the stories of the day, finding a way to find our songs and that old pattern, that ancient pattern, once again, I think is something that we can't outgrow. I think that is the therapeutic remedy.
It is. And that's the stuff that glues together the generations. And it's simple, actually. It's not something we need to invest a lot of complexity in. We can actually do it simply as a practice of civility and decency towards one another, even in family systems. So
on that note, I want to respect your time, Zach, and I know you've got some things to move to, but I want to just actually do one last little diversion, because I've never really heard this brought up, well, occasionally on a few talks. I know Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke may sort of touch into these kind of points, but again, back to Dr. McGilchrist, Ian McGilchrist, and the left and the right, and I think a lot of people that whoever may choose to hear and listen to this is going to be listening to our words and to our ideas and to our articulations. And that's great. I mean, I've always took great pleasure, when I find that inspiration from hearing, these shared words. I don't think what people realize, though, and this is something I'd like, given the nature of this medium, this is virtual, we're not here in the same room together. And of course, it's interesting, our friendship has been a virtual friendship, and yet we found our way to find really lovely connection in that. And one thing I'll speak for myself, but I think I'm probably safe to say I'm speaking for you, that throughout our time talking here, there has been a tremendous felt sense that that what you've said has evoked, feelings and movement, and some of ease and some where I've had to struggle, ideas that are just difficult ideas that within dis-ease because of their implication. But I do want to say, I have felt a lot here in our conversation today. And I hope that's been conveyed again, in the prosody, the tone, the words, the excitement of our things. What are you feeling in this? And what is your thought? What is your feeling about feeling through this medium? Because this is where we are right in this world right now, these kind of mediums.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Yeah. No, I felt energized. I came in a little I felt more energy, more clarity as we've continued to speak. And and I think that is something that you're actually allowing me to have as a result of the way you're holding me as a host and in your presence, even though you're, however many hundreds of miles away you are. So there is something to the possibility of digital intimacy and digital community. But it is worth saying that I do believe the main informational content that's transmitted in communication is often not semantic. And so video like this is way better than just audio, which is way better than just text. which is way better than asynchronous text, which is way better than asynchronous text mediated through some company who runs an algorithm on you that you don't even understand. So this idea of like, what is communication? Communication requires emotion, and learning requires emotion. And it's often the case people believe that you should get the emotion out of the way so that you can be a clear thinker. And that the problem with what everyone is having is that they're not thinking clearly. Like those people over there who read those other media sources are stupid. They're not thinking clearly. But when you see people argue, you realize it's not about what they're thinking. It's about what they're feeling. And it's often about a whole bunch of unexpressed needs and emotions, which have been coupled to this kind of semantic content, which is actually irrelevant. And you know it's irrelevant because they don't care what the truth is. And this goes for the left and the right. They don't really care what the truth is, but they are staking some kind of moral ground around their identity with the way they're using language here. So there's, again, even now, we are using language to create social cohesion, but it's like through in-grouping and out-grouping. And so much of the emotion we associate with communication now, because of this environment and it's kind of like Wild West early days form, has been negative, like increasing polarity, increasing sense that people are just stupid and don't understand, increasing sense of being like unable to say what you really believe because there's all of this kind of like weird pressure and surveillance to say certain things. All of that stuff is being mixed up with this right here between us. And this right here between us is being mixed up with you and your child at a dinner table having a 45-minute conversation without interruption. Right. And so it's kind of like a return to the ontologies of place and human and personhood.
And it's saying that I want to actually say I'm still a believer in place and time and touch and the non-virtual. And I look forward to that day, by the way, when we
totally. We're actually not that far away.
We're not that far away. And as soon as the borders open up and my son's back skating in Placid and we can, we can find that connection. But here's the thing. One thing I want to just challenge lightly. I agree with your assessment of from the rich to poor of the in-person to the visual to the auditory to the textual to the asynchronous to the mediated. But here's what's really interesting. This is obviously a poverty compared to in-person. But if we use it in a resourceful way and say, okay, in this poverty, what can I do to overcome the boundaries of the impoverishment? That we can feel, that we can reach, that we can be touched, that we can dance, that we can find a mutual song, I think that this is up my game. That when I now take this back to real life, my RL world or my real life, and I get to connect. You know what I'm saying? So because and then one thing I would say is, again, in my role as a physician in the psychotherapeutic work I do, I am amazed that health and this process, I don't like the word healing often how it gets used, but this process, this deep, mysterious process called coming into health, we'll call it healing, how it occurs in richness and it occurs in impoverishment. And when it occurs, it is still full health. I'm just like, wow, it happened on the phone. It happened over a video call, or it happens in the office. And when it happens, it actually happens. And it's like, and I don't know what to make of all of that still. I just want to be that it is a sort of a beacon of as we go forward, of possibility that these things are limited and they're poor and they're impoverished, and we should not pretend that they're not. And yet, this thing called wholeness, fullness, health, life, and its expressions can still, like streams, working their way through the landscape. Maybe they're just underground, maybe they're small, but those streams still meander and they work their way to a river, to an ocean. And I think it's there. And I think and I just want to, maybe that's a way to wrap up. I just want to wrap up with the gratitude and say, I really felt that. And I really enjoyed our conversation today. And I've enjoyed our friendship. And I've enjoyed how this conversation has taken it a step further yet again. And for whatever way that may be a modeling or an exampling, well, let's just let them hear from you and I. It's true. This medium can be something other than just disappointment and loss. You have to get past the grief, the disappointment and loss. It is disappointment and loss. But once you get past it, there's gratitude.
Totally. And it's similar to those humanoids that first began to use their vocal cords to do language instead of singing, right?
Yeah.
It's like we're stepping into a new medium. It's the tricking ourselves into thinking that it's that there isn't loss. I think that's the risk. But as soon as you realize the limitation, just like with language, right? Some people, they see the limitations of language and they want to throw it away, but you can't. You need language. But you have to know that it's language and that there are other modalities. So yeah, I'm completely with you. And obviously I've hugely enjoyed this. And
me too.